In the summer of 2028, the worst drought in nearly a century broke eastern Colorado in half. Reservoirs fell to record lows. Wheat curled and died, weeks before it should have seen a combine. Machines worth more than most houses sat parked in dirt yards, engines cold, because there was nothing left in the ground worth cutting. Across the county, farmers stopped measuring the season in bushels. They measured it in what they'd lost. On one farm, something else was moving through the dust. 50 donkeys, walking in a slow, deliberate line. Seed on their backs, fencing wire, water barrels, forage cut fresh that morning. They weren't fast. They weren't the kind of animal anyone would put on a brochure. Their coats were rough, their legs scarred, their eyes carrying the wary intelligence of creatures that had once had to survive entirely on their own. While the rest of the county watched its investment die in the field, those 50 animals kept working. And nobody could explain why the man who owned them wasn't panicking. Why had he walked away from the one deal every other farmer in the county would have signed, without reading twice? To understand that, you have to go back 3 years, before the drought, before the whispers, before anyone understood that the smartest investment in modern farming might not have an engine, a GPS receiver, or a warranty. It might have 4 legs and a stubborn streak older than agriculture itself. Out here, opportunity doesn't knock. It slides quietly onto the kitchen table and waits. For Ethan Caldwell, it arrived on a cool October morning, carried in by a man in a spotless truck who didn't belong on these roads. Ethan was 54. He'd spent nearly 30 years working the same 1,200 acres of dryland wheat and grazing pasture outside Springfield, Colorado, land that ran flat to the horizon and never once let him take rain for granted. He looked like a man the prairie had built on purpose. 6 feet and broad through the shoulders, hands shaped by 3 decades of feed sacks and fence wire and pre-dawn starts. The sun had carved deep lines into his face and bled the color out of his sandy hair at the temples. His beard was neat and gray. He rarely showed much on his face, but the people who knew him said his real strength was never his size. It was that he didn't flinch. Hailstorms, market crashes, fuel spikes, forecasts that lied to him season after season. None of it had ever moved him, which is exactly why the offer on his table should have been an easy yes. A regional grain processor wanted him locked in for the long haul. Expand production over 3 years, buy bigger combines, overhaul the irrigation, commit nearly every acre to high-yield wheat, and in exchange, they'd guarantee him prices well above anything the market had ever paid him. It was the best number he'd ever seen on paper. Better than his father had made, better than his grandfather had dreamed of. Any other man on his road would have signed before the coffee cooled. Ethan didn't. He folded the contract, slid it back into its envelope, and set it on his office shelf. It sat there 2 weeks, not because the numbers were wrong, because something underneath them was. Farming has always run on 2 questions, pulling in opposite directions. How much can this field give me this year? And the one almost nobody asks anymore. What will this same field still be capable of giving 30 years from now? Modern agriculture pays extremely well for the first question, and almost nothing for the second. And that imbalance is exactly what's quietly bankrupting the ground itself. Bigger machines cover more acres in less time. More horsepower pulls wider implements. Sensors track soil moisture down to the percentage point. All of it real progress. All of it feeding a planet that needs feeding. But nobody puts the real cost on a spec sheet. A fully loaded modern combine can weigh over 30 tons. Every pass across the same ground presses down a little harder on soil that was never built to hold that kind of weight. And healthy soil isn't dirt. It's a living structure, laced with air pockets and water channels that roots and fungi and billions of microorganisms depend on to survive. Compress it enough times and it stops behaving like something alive. It starts behaving like concrete. Water quits sinking in. Roots quit reaching. The microbial life underneath, the stuff no one sees, the stuff that actually keeps a field productive, starts to die off in silence. And in a drought, every one of those dead inches becomes a field that can't drink even when the rain finally comes. Ethan had known this his whole life, long before any agronomist put a name to it. His father taught him to read soil with his hands. If you can't push your fingers into it after a good rain, his father used to say, the wheat can't either. That sentence had outlived his father by 11 years. And after another summer that came and went without enough rain to soak past the topsoil, it was the only sentence Ethan could hear. 3 weeks after the contract landed on his table, Ethan got in his truck and drove nearly 400 miles west. Not to a dealership, not to a seed conference, not to another farm. He was headed to a federal wild burro adoption center, the kind of place that exists because public land can only support so many animals before overgrazing starts killing the desert itself. Every year, thousands of wild burros are gathered off that land and offered to qualified adopters rather than put down. Almost nobody who shows up is a farmer. They're hobbyists, trail riders, people looking for one gentle pack animal for weekend trips into the hills. Nobody comes looking for a workforce. When Ethan walked onto the holding grounds, rows of burros pressed themselves to the back of their pens and watched him the way prey animals watch anything new. Thick-necked, compact, built low and strong for rock instead of speed, ears swiveling toward sounds he couldn't even hear yet. The adoption manager met him with a half smile. Looking for one? Ethan shook his head. Looking for 50. The man actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. 50? I've run this program almost 20 years. Nobody's ever asked me for 50. Well, Ethan said, now somebody has. He didn't smile when he said it. He wasn't joking. News in a farming town moves faster than weather. Within days, everyone in Springfield knew 2 things. Ethan Caldwell had turned down the biggest grain contract the county had ever seen, and he'd spent a good chunk of his savings hauling home 50 wild donkeys that had never once worn a harness. Nobody could make the math work. His tractors were old. 2 of his irrigation pivots needed parts he'd been putting off for a year. His oldest combine broke down often enough that the mechanics in town knew him on a first-name basis and braced themselves whenever his number came up. By every rule anyone in that county lived by, that was the equipment he should have fixed first. Instead, his pastures filled with animals nobody could put a plow behind. People weren't cruel about it to his face, just baffled, quietly, carefully baffled, the way small towns are when they don't want to say what they're thinking out loud. One evening, picking up hydraulic fittings at the co-op, an older rancher finally said what half the county had been chewing on for a week. Ethan, what in God's name are you going to do with 50 wild donkeys? Ethan thought about it for a second. I don't know yet, he said. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, it cracked it wide open, because everyone in Springfield had assumed Ethan Caldwell was the last man in the county who'd make a decision without knowing exactly where it ended. But he hadn't bought labor. He'd bought time. He'd bought margin. He'd bought a hedge against a future he couldn't yet describe, but could already feel coming, the way you feel a storm behind you before you ever hear the thunder. He was betting that everyone chasing bigger, faster, and heavier was about to learn the same lesson his father had taught him for free, decades earlier, standing in a field after the rain. The most expensive mistake a farmer can make isn't the one that costs him money today. It's assuming tomorrow's ground will forgive him the same way yesterday's did. The first burro wouldn't leave the trailer, not from fear, from calculation. For nearly 20 minutes, the small gray jack stood motionless, ears swiveling toward every unfamiliar sound. Wind on the equipment shed's tin roof, a meadowlark landing on the fence, another burro calling from somewhere out of sight. Then he stepped down. One hoof, then another. By sunset, all 50 had walked into the holding pasture. Nobody had pulled a single rope. Ethan knew that was a better start than it looked. People assume donkeys are stubborn and horses are obedient. It's backward. Horses evolved on open grassland, where survival meant fleeing first and sorting out the rest later. Donkeys evolved in desert and mountain terrain, where a wrong leap could mean a broken leg miles from water. So they don't react, they assess. To an impatient handler, that looks like defiance. To Ethan, it looked like intelligence. He wasn't after obedience. He was after trust, and trust doesn't take orders. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan walked the training pasture with a bucket of alfalfa pellets and a notebook. He wasn't teaching commands. He was watching. Who stayed close to the herd, who investigated new objects first, who waited, who led. By the second week, the herd had sorted itself. A sandy jenny, he named Clara, kept placing herself between the young ones and anything unfamiliar. Not aggressive, just steady enough to settle the whole group when something spooked them. A dark gray jack with a white muzzle earned the name Boone after he figured out how to work a gate latch twice, wandered next door to graze, and let himself back in without being asked. Then there was Dusty. Older, scarred across the shoulders, slow-moving, in a way that suggested he'd already survived more than most of the herd combined. He let the younger burros eat first every time. But whenever Ethan pushed the herd into unfamiliar ground, Dusty was the one who moved to the front. Leadership, Ethan realized, isn't always claimed. Sometimes it's just recognized. While the burros settled in, Ethan started paying closer attention to what was happening under his boots. A single teaspoon of healthy soil holds billions of organisms, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, earthworms, an entire ecosystem that decides how much water a field can hold and whether a crop survives a bad year. Healthy soil breathes. Compacted soil suffocates. He started digging test holes across fields that had been farmed the same way for decades, and didn't like what he found. A few inches down, his shovel hit dense, root-choking layers. Irrigation water pooled on top instead of soaking through. Earthworms, once everywhere on this land, had all but disappeared. None of it had happened overnight. None of it would fix itself overnight either. That spring, Ethan retired 2 of his oldest tractors from regular field work. His neighbors assumed the machines had finally died for good. Partly true. Fuel costs kept climbing. Parts took weeks to arrive. Maintenance ate more of every season. But that wasn't the real reason. He wanted fewer heavy machines crossing his ground. Every pass of a loaded tractor compresses the air pockets beneath the surface a little more. Once those pockets collapse, rain stops soaking in, oxygen drops, and the microbial life that keeps soil alive starts to die off. It's one of modern farming's quiet paradoxes. The same machines that produce a record harvest can be slowly wearing out the ground's ability to produce the next one. Ethan wasn't rejecting his equipment. He was trying to stop it from spending capital it couldn't replace. Training 50 semi-wild burros wasn't dramatic. It was slow, one quiet morning at a time. First, they learned to follow a lead rope without panicking. Then, lightweight pack saddles. Then, empty panniers. Only months in did Ethan add real weight. Fence posts, toolboxes, water jugs, salt blocks, and even then, kept it light. Strength wasn't the lesson. Confidence was. A fit-pack donkey can carry roughly a fifth of its own body weight over rough ground on very little water, which is exactly why civilizations across North Africa, Southern Europe, and the Middle East relied on them for thousands of years. Not the fastest animal, just the one you could count on. By midsummer, the burros were quietly replacing dozens of tractor trips a week. Fencing staples out to the north pasture, Boone and Clara. Tools across the creek, Dusty. Mineral blocks for the cattle. 4 burros could deliver them and leave the ground behind them almost untouched. Each trip saved a little fuel. Each one skipped a little compaction. Small on their own, not small for long. The first warning came during wheat flowering. Most springs, storms rolled through eastern Colorado every few days. That year they simply stopped. Forecasts promised rain that dissolved on the horizon before it arrived. Ponds cracked into dry mud. Creeks that should have still been running by late June went silent. Meteorologists blamed a stalled high-pressure system. Climatologists pointed to broader shifts across the West. Farmers didn't need either explanation. They'd seen enough dry years to recognize the shape of another one. By July, the talk at the grain elevator had changed completely. Nobody mentioned expanding acreage anymore. It was all rainfall totals, feed prices, insurance claims, and whether next year might be better. Ethan listened, then drove home. That evening, he didn't take a tractor out. He saddled 4 burros and rode out to mend fence under a sky so clear it looked almost wrong. That's when he noticed it. Where the neighboring fields had already crusted hard and sun-baked, his soil still broke apart easily under his boots. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to stop him. He knelt, scooped up a handful, squeezed it gently. It crumbled into loose, dark clumps and fell apart between his fingers. The texture his father used to call good aggregation. Good soil doesn't fight your hands. His father had told him once. It works with them. Ethan looked out across the prairie, toward the last light. For the first time in 3 years, he wondered if the land was starting to answer the question that had been sitting on his kitchen table since October. If it was, the real test hadn't even started yet. By late August, the drought had stopped being a weather event. It had become a way of life. The wheat fields around Springfield had faded from green to dull gold and brown, weeks before harvest should have started. Every gust lifted loose topsoil into thin curtains of dust that drifted across the county roads and settled on trucks, fence posts, idle machinery. Older farmers had seen dry years. None remembered one like this. The Extension Office's weekly reports showed moisture levels lower than anything on record. Reservoirs kept dropping. Wells that had served farms for generations struggled to keep up. Every gallon mattered. So did every mistake. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. 3 years earlier, he'd been offered a contract built on producing more grain than ever, backed by bigger machines and greater efficiency. Now those same machines were the liability. 30-ton combines bogged down in fields baked hard as brick, tires spinning through dry powder before sinking under their own weight, dust-choked air filters within hours, engines overheated past 100 degrees. The tractors still worked. The land no longer wanted them. Drought isn't just the absence of rain. Healthy soil, rich in organic matter, and threaded with channels from roots, fungi, and earthworms, absorbs water fast and holds it long after a storm passes. Compacted soil does the opposite. It sheds water instead of drinking it, exposes roots instead of shielding them, loses life instead of sustaining it. Heavy machinery doesn't cause a drought, but over years, it can make one far worse. Scientists call the trait Ethan had been chasing soil resilience. A field's ability to take a bad season without losing its long-term productivity. Fields with more organic matter and less compaction routinely outlast their neighbors in dry years, even under identical rainfall. He'd spent 3 years rebuilding that resilience, not with chemicals, not with new technology, just one question, asked every morning. Does this job really need a machine? More often than he'd expected, the answer was no. Before sunrise, 50 burros waited outside the equipment barn, already knowing the routine. Clara carried veterinary supplies, Boone hauled fencing tools, Dusty hauled water to cattle, grazing miles from the nearest tank. Younger pairs moved mineral blocks, irrigation parts, cover crop seed, produce, bound for the farmer's market. No diesel, no overheating, no compacted wheel tracks, just slow, steady work, the kind that made drivers slow down on the county road. just to watch. The animals moved without urgency because they had no reason to hurry, testing uncertain footing before committing to it, whether on rocky hillsides or dry creek beds. People still called them stubborn. Ethan just smiled. Stubborn animals don't survive a desert for thousands of years. Careful ones do. One September afternoon, a familiar truck pulled into Ethan's driveway. The grain company's rep climbed out with another leather folder. Not an expansion offer this time, but a renegotiation. Too many farms had missed their targets. Some were abandoning their contracts outright. The company needed grain, reliable grain. "I can still get you a better price than ever," the rep said. Ethan watched Boone nudge a curious foal clear of an open gate, then looked back at the man. "My goal was never the biggest harvest." Then what was it? Making sure there's still a harvest 20 years from now. The conversation ended there. Some offers arrived too late to matter. No farm escaped the drought, and Ethan's was no exception. Wheat yields dropped. Hay production fell. Ponds shrank enough to force cattle to be moved. A hard year collects something from everyone. But next to the surrounding farms, his fields held up. Where neighboring ground cracked into hard plates, his soil still crumbled loosely between visiting agronomists' fingers. Earthworms had come back. Roots reached deeper. Organic matter had climbed steadily for 3 seasons, and his fields absorbed rainfall noticeably faster than the land around them. None of it happened overnight. Healthy soil works like a savings account. Small, consistent deposits that only pay off years later, exactly when you need them most. The Burrows hadn't performed a miracle. They'd simply let Ethan stop asking more of the land than it could give. The visitors started quietly, then didn't stop. Within weeks, trucks lined Ethan's driveway most Saturday mornings, some carrying notebooks, some carrying soil samples, a few admitting they'd spent years thinking he'd lost his mind, and now just wanted to understand. Nobody was there to replace their tractors with donkeys. That was never the point. Ethan still planted and harvested with modern equipment. Technology wasn't the enemy. Dependence was. Kneeling in a wheat field one afternoon, he picked up a handful of loose soil and let it fall through his fingers. "This is the most valuable thing I own." "The land?" someone asked. "No, the life inside it." Nobody spoke for a moment. Crops don't grow because tractors are powerful. They grow because soil is alive, and machines can either help that or quietly wear it down. The choice belongs to the farmer. Springfield's elementary school started running field trips out to the ranch. Kids came expecting 50 funny-looking donkeys and left having learned about watersheds, pollinators, cover crops, earthworms, native grasses, the whole quiet machinery of a living field. Ethan always closed the tour the same way, pointing toward Clara, Dusty, Boone, and the rest of the herd grazing under the open sky. "People think these animals saved my farm. They didn't. They reminded me how farming worked before we decided every problem could be solved by making the machine bigger." Some of those kids remembered that long after the bus pulled away. Years later, the $1 million grain contract was just an envelope yellowing on a shelf in Ethan's office, its numbers no longer impressive to him. Across the room hung a different record of wealth. Photographs. Clara leading the herd through spring wildflowers. Boone hauling tools after a snowstorm. Dusty standing beneath an old cottonwood while another generation of young burros followed his lead. Those pictures measured something no spreadsheet ever could. Profit is easy to count. Resilience isn't. The drought ended. Rain came back. Reservoirs filled. Tractors rolled across the plains again. And life moved on, the way it always does. But Springfield had changed. More farmers started experimenting with cover crops. Some cut unnecessary traffic across their fields. A few even adopted pack donkeys, not to replace their tractors, but because they'd finally understood what Ethan had been showing them all along. The burros were never the solution. They were the reminder. that progress isn't always about adding more. Sometimes, it's about knowing what to leave untouched. Every farmer inherits two things: a piece of land and the responsibility to leave it better than they found it. The first belongs to them. The second belongs to everyone who comes after. That's worth more than any contract ever promised.